Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, spent years outside the global spotlight, overshadowed by its larger and more influential neighbors. Despite its rich cultural heritage, vibrant traditions, and resilient population, it remained largely unnoticed. Beneath the surface, however, a crisis was brewing, one that would shake the country to its core and force it to take radical steps for survival. The Sahel region, a vast expanse of semi-arid land stretching across West Africa, had become a breeding ground for insurgent groups. These factions thrived on instability, exploiting weak borders, minimal government control, and widespread poverty. Over time, their influence grew, spreading violence and chaos throughout the region. Burkina Faso, with a population exceeding 21 million, found itself caught in the crossfire as the insurgency escalated. The rise of militant groups in the Sahel did not happen overnight. The seeds of instability were sown years before with political turmoil, economic hardship, and the collapse of neighboring states, creating the perfect environment for extremist groups to flourish. The 2011 fall of Libya played a significant role in this development. With the Libyan government overthrown, large caches of weapons flooded into West Africa, arming militant factions that had long been waiting for an opportunity to expand their operations. Mali became one of the first countries to experience the full force of this new wave of insurgency. After the rebellion in 2012, jihadist groups seized large portions of northern Mali, using the region as a stronghold to launch further attacks. The instability spilled over into Burkina Faso, initially as a secondary concern. At first, the country served as a transit route for armed groups, moving between Mali and Niger. However, by 2015, Burkina Faso itself became a direct target. The attacks began sporadically, with armed groups raiding villages, targeting security forces, and ambushing convoys. As time went on, their strategy became more systematic. They would enter rural communities, assassinate local leaders, and impose their own rule. This form of intimidation and control forced entire villages to flee, creating a humanitarian crisis. The insurgents' goal was clear: to destabilize the government and establish their own sphere of influence within the country. The impact of the growing insurgency was devastating. Entire villages were emptied. As residents abandoned their homes in fear of attack, businesses shut down and economic activity came to a halt. Markets that once bustled with merchants and traders fell silent, replaced by an era of uncertainty. Farmers, who formed the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy, could no longer safely tend to their fields. The risk of venturing too far from home was too great. As armed groups patrolled the countryside, ready to attack those they saw as enemies, the country's education system suffered as well. Thousands of schools were forced to close, leaving an entire generation of Burkina Faso children without access to learning. Parents, fearing for their children's safety, refused to send them to school. Teachers abandoned their posts, knowing that extremist groups often targeted educational institutions as symbols of government influence. The long-term consequences of this disruption in education were dire, as an uneducated youth population became more vulnerable to radicalization and economic hardship. Meanwhile, the military struggled to respond effectively. Burkina Faso's armed forces, while dedicated and willing to fight, were underfunded and under-equipped. Years of neglect had left them ill-prepared to combat a rapidly evolving insurgency. Their outdated tactics and limited resources made it difficult to push back against highly mobile and well-armed militants. Each time the military attempted to reclaim lost territory, insurgents would retreat into the vast, rugged terrain, only to return and attack again when the soldiers withdrew. As the situation worsened, frustration grew among the population. Citizens took to the streets demanding real leadership. someone who would not just talk about solving the problem, but actually take decisive action. The government at the time, struggling under pressure, failed to provide meaningful solutions. In response to this growing dissatisfaction, a change in leadership became inevitable. In September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged as the face of a new era. Young, determined, and willing to take bold risks, Traoré led a coup that removed the transitional government of Paul Henri Damiba. His rise to power was not merely a political maneuver. The people wanted a leader who understood their struggles, someone who had seen the devastation firsthand and was willing to take aggressive steps to restore stability. Traoré's approach was markedly different from his predecessors. Rather than relying on foreign aid or waiting for international intervention, he focused on making Burkina Faso self-reliant. His philosophy was simple: Burkina Faso must defend itself by any means necessary. This shift in mindset led to a complete restructuring of the country's security strategy. One of his most crucial decisions was to invest heavily in military modernization. He recognized that traditional defense strategies were no longer sufficient in the fight against insurgency. Ground troops alone could not effectively counter a decentralized and highly mobile enemy. To change the game, Burkina Faso needed to dominate the battlefield in a way that its adversaries could not counter. The answer lay in air power. Throughout modern history, control of the skies has proven to be a decisive factor in warfare. Countries that wield a superior air capabilities can monitor enemy movements, launch precision strikes, and respond to threats with unmatched speed. Traoré understood this reality and wasted no time in implementing an eccentric military strategy. Burkina Faso rapidly acquired and deployed advanced surveillance, drones, fighter jets, and intelligence-gathering aircraft. These technologies allowed the military to track insurgent movements in real time, eliminating the element of surprise that the militants had previously relied upon. No longer could armed groups hide in dense forests or remote desert areas. Burkina Faso now had eyes in the sky. The shift to air power yielded immediate results. Military operations that once took weeks to plan and execute could now be carried out in a matter of hours. Drones provided 24/7 surveillance, identifying enemy positions and alerting ground forces before an attack could take place. Precision airstrikes neutralized threats before they reached vulnerable villages, preventing bloodshed before it began. The psychological impact of this transformation was immense. Villagers who had lived in constant fear began to feel a sense of security return. Farmers went back to their fields, knowing that military drones patrolled the area, watching for potential threats. Children could once again attend school without the looming fear of attacks. Markets reopened, and trade routes that had been cut off due to insecurity became operational again. However, technological advancements alone were not enough. Burkina Faso needed skilled personnel to operate and maintain its new military capabilities. Recognizing this, Traoré's government launched extensive training programs to build a new generation of military specialists. Young men and women were trained to become drone pilots, intelligence analysts, and cybersecurity experts. The goal was to create a self-sufficient defense force, one that did not rely on foreign contractors or external assistance. The introduction of these training programs marked a turning point. Burkina Faso's military was no longer just a conventional fighting force. It was evolving into a sophisticated, technologically advanced defense system. Soldiers were not only trained in combat tactics, but also in strategic thinking, data analysis, and rapid decision-making. Each new recruit represented a step toward long-term national security and resilience beyond the military. Civilians were also brought into the country's security efforts, recognizing that national defense could not be left solely to the armed forces. The government implemented community-based security initiatives. Ordinary citizens were trained to identify and report suspicious activities, creating a vast network of vigilance across the country. This grassroots approach strengthened the bond between the military and the people, ensuring that everyone played a role in protecting the nation. The transformation of Burkina Faso's security apparatus did not go unnoticed. Other countries in the Sahel, facing similar insurgent threats, began to take note. Burkina Faso's rapid modernization and strategic shift served as a model for neighboring nations, demonstrating that African countries could take control of their own security without relying heavily on Western intervention. Despite these successes, challenges remain. Insurgents continue to adapt, shifting their tactics in response to Burkina Faso's evolving military strategies. The fight is far from over, and maintaining momentum will require continuous innovation, investment, and vigilance. However, what is undeniable is that Burkina Faso is no longer a passive victim of terrorism. It has reclaimed its agency, proving that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, a determined nation can rise, fight back, and secure its future. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment below, and see you in the next video.